Welcome to the City of Sunshine. Tuberculosis is a bacteria first discovered by Dr. Koch in Germany in 1882. During the 19th century, thousands of Americans and people in Europe as well as around the world were dying of tuberculosis. Back in those days, they called it consumption because victims' bodies grew so thin because of a lack of appetite, high fevers, and bad coughs that people thought the bodies were consuming themselves. Human beings have had real trouble with tuberculosis over the years. Egyptian mummies have been found that were buried thousands of years ago, and there were lesions on the chest cavities attributed to tuberculosis. Hippocrates spoke of tuberculosis in Greece 2,400 years ago, and yet the cure for tuberculosis was found only in 1944 with the discovery of streptomycin. Prior to the discovery of streptomycin, doctors were prescribing rest cures in moderate climates. And up steps Colorado Springs, founded in 1871 by General William Jackson Palmer, who was also a railroad builder. By 1873 and 1874, our town fathers were already advertising in the United States and in Europe, saying, "Come to Colorado Springs, cure your tuberculosis here in the City of Sunshine." And doctors were sending people. What you're going to see in the next few minutes will be stories about doctors, diets, treatments, and some strange cures. Enjoy.
Throughout the City of Sunshine exhibit, we have different stations that give you short biographical sketches about different health seekers who came to the Pikes Peak region. And we will follow them throughout their stay in the Pikes Peak region to see what happens to them. I would like to introduce you to Mr. Sedley B. Jones. He was born in the late 1850s in Jackson, Mississippi. Most likely he was born into slavery. And as part of the Great Migration, he left the South and came west. We know that he was in Colorado Springs by 1880. We know that he found employment at General Palmer's First Antlers Hotel as wait staff. The First Antlers was known to hire African Americans for their wait staff, and that was a great place for employment for many African Americans who came to Colorado Springs in the early years. He was very active in the Republican Party, Party of Lincoln, and we know that he put down roots very soon after he arrived.
This part of the tour, we are going to discuss Dr. Webb. Dr. Webb was a well-known figure in Colorado Springs. He treated tuberculosis, he wrote about tuberculosis, he formed societies about tuberculosis, and was intimately associated with tuberculosis. His first wife died of tuberculosis. This is a replica of his office. If you peek inside, you'll see things very similar to what we see today in doctors' offices. How did people come to Dr. Webb? Once a diagnosis was arrived at in their home communities, a prescription was written, sending them someplace to treat tuberculosis. Many of them arrived in Colorado Springs. When they arrived, a local physician was found, hopefully Dr. Webb. A treatment plan was set up, and for the rest of the tour, you're going to explore that.
I grew up in Colorado Springs and was always fascinated by those large homes with those beautiful sun porches. I imagined as a child that it would be a great place to have a sleepover. And I also assumed that the reason they were built in the first place was to give the people who lived in the home a cooler place to sleep during the summer. It wasn't until I became a volunteer at the Pioneers Museum that I realized the real reason was that because in the late 1800s and the early 1900s, Colorado Springs had become a destination for people suffering from the disease of tuberculosis, specifically pulmonary tuberculosis. In the late 1800s, a German doctor discovered that the cause of TB was a germ or a bacteria. And the reason people came to Colorado Springs was that the prevailing knowledge at the time said that at this altitude, the air was germ-free. So people flocked to Colorado Springs. This influx changed the architecture of the residences in Colorado Springs. Wealthy patients or their families built large homes with sun porches or added a sun porch to the existing home. This was year-round treatment, which probably got a little uncomfortable in the winter. We have a local resident who remembers waking up in the sun porch as a child with snow on her blankets. Brr. It also allowed the family to be isolated from the patient so that they were not as likely to catch TB from the patient. Not only was it year-round, but it was not a quick recovery, if there was a recovery at all. Patients often had to spend a year or two on the porch, in the bed, trying to recuperate or have a remission from TB. I think after all of us having just gone through a shelter-in-place policy, that we can probably understand what that felt like for these patients, except we have the internet. Dr. Webb, who you just learned about, thought that this treatment, the sun porch treatment, was the kindest, much better than the TB huts and tents you're going to learn about next. So that's the sun porch. Mary and I have enjoyed visiting with you, especially Mary. She has not had many visitors these last few months.
So it's time to do an update about what happened to Mr. Sedley B. Jones. In the 1890s, we know he married a Miss Belle Henderson from Missouri. And he had been working at the Antlers Hotel. And when the first Antlers burned down in 1898, he, like many fellow African Americans, lost his job. And when the second Antlers opened in 1901, the management decided not to rehire any black staff due to a change in demographics, which had happened by then, and also a change in racial attitudes. We also know that around the same time that he lost his job, he was diagnosed with tuberculosis.
Behind me is a real tuberculosis hut made of wood. They can also be made of canvas, and this one specifically comes from the Modern Woodmen of America Sanatorium, which you will learn about later. While living at a sanatorium, patients would have every second of their days lived out. This schedule would include rest, heliotherapy, consistent pulse and temperature checks, and a special diet. While living at a sanatorium, patients would live in a TB hut such as this one. Why don't you go ahead and take a look inside and see what you can find. This TB hut and many others were open on the top and the bottom to create more airflow for the patients. Here, they would eat a special diet called rare, raw, and rye. They would eat rare beef, raw eggs, and rye bread. Then they would drink a lot of milk, up to a gallon each day. Can you imagine eating something like that? While living at the sanatorium, patients would do something called heliotherapy, which is also known as sun therapy. This is where they would sit outside in the sun and absorb the rays, which was thought to have killed tuberculosis. The thin, dry, and fresh air of Colorado Springs, combined with the long hours of rest, heliotherapy, and the strict diet, helped cure many patients of tuberculosis.
The three mainstays of treatment for tuberculosis were the rest cure, the climate cure, and a healthy diet. So you have heard more details about that. Apart from these mainstays, there were also some complementary therapies, if we can call them that, and also more invasive. For example, I want to mention an artificial pneumothorax, which meant the affected lung, was collapsed artificially by introducing a needle into the thorax and inserting air into the pleural cavity, which kept the lung collapsed. And it had been learned beforehand that patients with a spontaneous pneumothorax, where the lung collapsed on its own, likely from the disease, actually did better, and the lung had a tendency to heal itself. So this was employed as one treatment method for more advanced cases of tuberculosis, pulmonary tuberculosis. And the lung might have remained collapsed for up to a year or even longer as needed. You have also heard about the importance of heliotherapy, therapy making use of the sunshine, which was very prevalent in Colorado Springs. People were often basking in the sun, scantily clad. And they also tried to direct beams of sunlight to areas of the bodies that were infected with tuberculosis. One of the more common organs affected was the larynx. People often suffered from laryngeal tuberculosis. And in order to treat the larynx, one of the TB sufferers, Frank Verba, who also happened to be an engineer, redesigned a laryngoscope, which you can see on the top shelf here. It helped focus the sunbeams into people's throat. And they often sat outside in the sunshine with their mouths open, so the sunlight was directed directly into the larynx. So as you can imagine, that was not very comfortable. And we know that they were aware of the potential damage of sunlight to the retina, so people did wear sunglasses, fortunately. At the next stop, you will learn about the different TB sanatoria in Colorado Springs.
Come around the early 20th century, there were dozens of tuberculosis sanitariums in this region, and they catered to, some of the larger ones catered to hundreds of patients, some catered to just a handful, but basically you could get any service that you could afford. On the map here, you'll see different numbers that correlate to different sanitariums, and you'll be able to see where these sanitariums are as we go along. So one of the more famous sanitariums was the Craigmore Sanitarium. This was funded by General William Palmer, but in 1910 was a modestly funded sanitarium that was purchased by Dr. Alexis Foster. Dr. Foster provided some luxurious amenities. He really improved the cottages, and ultimately the Craigmore Sanitarium was where the very wealthy came to be treated. Ultimately, the Craigmore Sanitarium was forced into foreclosure by the Depression, was transferred to the state of Colorado, and is now the main hall at the University of Colorado, Colorado Springs. One of the larger sanitariums was the Modern Woodmen of America Sanitarium. The Modern Woodmen of America was a insurance fraternity that acquired 1,300 acres about 10 miles northwest of here in Colorado Springs. They had about 180 different cottages. They served 12,000 patients throughout its history, but they also included a farm, an orchard, a prize-winning herd, hospitals. So it was a very, very large, very expansive facility. In 1910, the Sunny Rest facility opened up, and that became a permanent facility for patients of limited means. It was funded by the Associated Charities, which ultimately became the United Way. They provided $25,000 of upfront money, and they also provided a 2-year endowment for the facility. Patients who came here paid little to nothing. In fact, some of the services were even funded by donations throughout the community. A wing was established, the Watt Memorial Wing was created later on to honor the generosity of Marjorie Palmer Watt, whose generosity helped find the sanitarium to begin with.
So this is our last checkup on Mr. Sedley B. Jones. We've talked about people coming to Colorado Springs as health seekers to seek treatment for their tuberculosis, and the treatment mainstays being rest and climate cure and healthy diet. So many of these treatments were provided at the local sanatoria. As you can imagine, not everybody was able to afford such a treatment. People often came and stayed for months, if not years at a time. People were asked to save a year's salary at the very least, perhaps 2 if possible. A lot of people were unable to do that kind of intense, expensive treatment. So many people moved to areas where the climate was healthful, and whether or not Mr. Jones came here because of the climate, we don't really know. But he lived in Colorado Springs and benefited from our climate all the time. We also know that he sought treatment temporarily at the Glockner Sanatorium, which later became Penrose Hospital. We know in 1900 he was treated there at least for a portion of the time. And he really represents the group of health seekers, you know, who sought treatment off and on in intervals as they could afford it. And during the rest of the time, they just had to try to manage on their own. We know that he survived tuberculosis, very likely. He lived to the ripe old age of almost 80. We don't actually know his cause of death, but likely it was something different from tuberculosis. His first wife died and he remarried, again, a lady named Fanny, and Fanny outlived him. And Mr. Sedley B. Jones lived until 1939 and is buried at our local Evergreen Cemetery.
I hope you enjoyed your tour. I'd like to also tell you that our work is only half done. There is a new virulent strain of tuberculosis called MDR-TB, multiple drug-resistant tuberculosis. It is ravaging small countries where there's great poverty and malnutrition. It's important for countries that are wealthier, like the United States, Canada, and some of the European countries, to fund research to find a cure. Because if we don't find a cure and find one fairly fast, this new strain of tuberculosis will be the scourge of the 21st century, just like the old tuberculosis was the scourge of the 19th century. And in conclusion, I would like to thank General Palmer for founding Colorado Springs. If he came back here today, I think he would be very proud of the way his city has grown, how it's surrounded by parks and open areas and trails throughout the area as he had planned it. And he would be very excited about a local governmental organization called Parks and Open Spaces to promote this very thing. He also would be very happy to see the Olympic Training Center here and the new museum honoring our Olympic and Paralympic athletes. However, I think he would still like to have his city known as the City of Sunshine. Thank you.